Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century by William A. Darity, Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen. Narrated by J.D. Jackson. Introduction. Standing at the Crossroads. In order to see where we are going, we not only must see where we have been, but we must also understand where we have been. Ella Baker. The world has never seen any people turned loose to such destitution as were the 4 million slaves of the South. They were free without roofs to cover them, or bread to eat, or land to cultivate, and as a consequence died in such numbers as to awaken the hope of their enemies that they would soon disappear. Frederick Douglass, Celebrating the Past, Anticipating the Future. Racism and discrimination have perpetually crippled black economic opportunities. At several historic moments, the trajectory of racial inequality could have been altered dramatically, but at each juncture, the road chosen did not lead to a just and fair America. The formation of the Republic provided a critical moment when blacks might have been granted freedom and admitted to full citizenship. The Civil War and the Reconstruction era each offered openings to produce a true democracy thoroughly inclusive of black Americans. Had the New Deal project and the GI Bill fully included blacks, the nation would have widened the window of opportunity to achieve an equitable future. Passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s might have unlocked the door for America to eradicate racism. However, at none of these forks was the path to full justice taken. From Here to Equality is a book primarily about the economic divide between black and white Americans, how it came to be, and how it can be eliminated. Specifically, we contend a suitably designed program of reparations can close the divide. Black reparations can place America squarely on the path to racial equality. Reparations programs have been used strategically in the United States and throughout the world to provide redress for grievous injustices. These include the U.S. government's provision of reparations for Japanese Americans unjustly incarcerated, interned during World War II, the German government's provision of reparations for victims of the Nazi Holocaust, and the Canadian government's provision of compensation to indigenous peoples who were removed forcibly from their families and confined to Christian church-run Indian residential schools. Reversing the effects of slavery for newly emancipated human chattel was the goal of several plans put into action during and immediately following the Civil War. One of the country's earliest efforts to dramatically alter blacks' economic condition was the federal government's post-Civil War plan to give at least 40 acres of abandoned and confiscated land as well as a mule to each formerly enslaved family of 4, or 10 acres per person. While some maintain that this planned payment of land and a work animal to newly freed men and women in the 19th century is a figment of the black imagination, historical records confirm that the promise of reparations was not a myth. It was inscribed in federal legislation. In fact, the allocation activated in 1865 of 40 acres for formerly enslaved Africans was at least the second such measure the federal government had developed to assign land to the former chattel. The idea that reparations could be an effective method of addressing the effects of slavery and white supremacy has a long history, cycling in and out of popular discourse and the national policy arena. Reparations are as timely today as they were in the 1860s. The ultimate goal of From Here to Equality is to help rejuvenate discussions about and to promote reparations for African Americans. As the final chapter of this book will show, there are several mechanisms for reversing gross inequalities between blacks and whites that overcome the frequent reflexive reaction that this is impractical or infeasible. Real equality is a worthy goal, and it can be achieved. Reparations are a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. Where African Americans are concerned, the grievous injustices that make the case for reparations include slavery, legal segregation, Jim Crow, and ongoing discrimination and stigmatization. ARC, the acronym that stands for Acknowledgement, Redress, and Closure, characterizes the three essential elements of the reparations program that we are advocating. Acknowledgement, redress, and closure are components of any effective reparations project. Acknowledgement involves recognition and admission of the wrong by the perpetrators or beneficiaries of the injustice. For African Americans, this means the receipt of a formal apology and a commitment for redress on the part of the American people as a whole, a national act of declaration that a great wrong has been committed. But beyond an apology, acknowledgement requires those who benefited from the exercise of the atrocities to recognize the advantages they gained and commit themselves to the cause of redress. Redress potentially can take two forms, not necessarily mutually exclusive: restitution or atonement. Restitution is the restoration of survivors to their condition before the injustice occurred, or to a condition they might have attained had the injustice not taken place. Of course, it is impossible to restore those who were enslaved to a condition preceding their enslavement, not only because those who were enslaved are now deceased, but also because many thousands were born into slavery. But it is possible to move their descendants toward a more equitable position commensurate with the status they would have attained in the absence of the injustice or injustices. Atonement, as an alternative form of redress, occurs when perpetrators or beneficiaries meet conditions of forgiveness that are acceptable to the victims. Achieving these elements of a reparations program requires good faith negotiations between those who were wronged and the wrongdoers. There is no existing mechanism for establishing when African Americans collectively will have reached an agreement that sufficient steps have been taken to justify forgiveness. Consequently, atonement is difficult to accomplish. That is why in our proposal, we treat restitution as the appropriate form of redress. We have clear metrics for determining when restitution has been achieved that we do not have for establishing the same for atonement. Specifically, restitution for African Americans would eliminate racial disparities in wealth, income, education, health, sentencing and incarceration, political participation, and subsequent opportunities to engage in American political and social life. It will require not only an endeavor to compensate for past repression and exploitation, but also an endeavor to offset stubborn existing obstacles to full Black participation in American political and social life. Reparations demonstrably would be effective if an improved position for Blacks is associated with sharp and enduring reductions in racial disparities, particularly economic disparities like racial wealth inequality, and corresponding sharp and enduring improvements in Black well-being. Closure involves mutual reconciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, legal segregation, and ongoing discrimination toward Blacks. Whites and Blacks would come to terms over the past, confront the present, and unite to create a new and transformed United States of America. Once the reparations program is executed and racial inequality eliminated, African Americans would make no further claims for race-specific policies on their behalf from the American government, on the assumption that no new race-specific injustices are inflicted upon them. A central theme of From Here to Equality is the sustained American failure to recognize the pernicious impact of white supremacy and the sustained American failure to adopt national policies that reverse the effects of white supremacy. At each point that the nation stood at a critical crossroads with respect to its racial future, it chose the wrong fork. The first two chapters comprise Part 1 of From Here to Equality. In Chapter 1, we examine the historical trajectory of the Black reparations movement in the United States, demonstrating the consistent denial of efforts to establish a comprehensive program of compensation for Black America. Chapter 2 is devoted to a systematic analysis of the comparative current status of blacks vis-a-vis whites in the United States. We give particular attention to the racial gulf in wealth accumulation, because wealth, or net worth, is the most powerful indicator of the intergenerational effects of white supremacy on black economic well-being. In the same chapter, we also present evidence showing that many Americans are simply wrong about the magnitude and the causes of racial wealth disparities. Part 2 of the book is devoted to an analysis of the effects of the American system of slavery on the nation's economic and political development. The third chapter identifies the beneficiaries of slavery both in the near and longer terms. We examine the key role that slavery played in American economic development in both the North and the South. As we stress throughout the book, the case for justice must include identification of not only the perpetrators of racial harm, but also those who gained from the harm, whether or not they inflicted it. Chapter 4 examines the first major fork in the road for America, the possibility of ending slavery and producing black citizenship at the founding of the new nation. The period of struggle for independence from Britain was rich with possibilities that would have been engendered by ending slavery at the origin of the United States, but were summarily forsaken. In Part 3, we consider alternative routes not taken during the period of the Civil War. Chapter 5 is an in-depth exploration of the rejected option of compensated emancipation, an option that would have prevented or attenuated the war, while also ending black enslavement. Chapter 6 details anti-black atrocities that took place during the war. One may be surprised to learn the extent to which even the Union Army was unwilling to incorporate blacks who had joined their ranks as equals. Part 4 investigates the lost opportunities for constructing citizenship for the formerly enslaved in the aftermath of the war. Chapter 7 treats a variety of experiments conducted before, during, and after the Civil War to establish communities of freedmen predicated on creating opportunities for full participation in American life. Chapter 8 describes the ferocious post-war conflict over the radical Republicans' plan for Reconstruction, which included the provision of at least 40 acres of land for freedmen and full political participation for black men. The failure to take the radicals' path set the stage for the subsequent 150 years of black degradation. Chapter 9 records the destruction of the dreams and ambitions embodied in Reconstruction and the restoration of a regime of white rule in the post-Confederate South. Part 5 of From Here to Equality advances a bill of particulars for the outrages and damages wreaked upon black Americans during the century and a half since the Civil War. Chapter 10 focuses on the abuses of the Jim Crow era, the period of legal segregation in America, while Chapter 11 is devoted to the insufficiency of the Civil Rights era to produce racial equality in the United States. Chapter 10 pivots on the sequence of white massacres that resulted in the annihilation of black lives and property. Chapter 11 centers on the prolonged devaluation of black life throughout the post-Civil Rights era via discrimination and violence. The final part of the book consists of 2 chapters and provides a springboard to the design and implementation of a plan for black reparations. Chapter 12 constitutes a systematic response to reparations critics, while Chapter 13 outlines the potential structure of an actual reparations program. These last 2 chapters, taken together, supply a systematic response to customary logistical concerns raised about black reparations, with the final chapter offering a detailed description of how best to enact them. From Here to Equality draws a thick line from the nation's origins to the present. The case we build in this book is based on all 3 tiers or phases of injustice: slavery, American apartheid, Jim Crow, and the combined effects of present-day discrimination and the ongoing deprecation of black lives. Most advocates of black reparations have focused exclusively on the injustice of slavery as the basis for redress. Law professor Boris Bitker argued that the case for black reparations should center solely on the harms of legalized segregation, while Roy L. Brooks, also a legal scholar, has argued that the foundation for black reparations is the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. We submit that the Bill of Particulars for black reparations also must include contemporary ongoing injustices resulting in barriers and penalties for the black descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. Sociologist Joe Fegan catalogs the continuing injuries inflicted on black Americans, including wage penalties, physical and psycho-emotional health wounds, and community and institutional damages. Despite the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, a wave of federal legislation in the 1960s and 1970s intended to eliminate legal apartheid in the United States, and the enactment of anti-discrimination laws, blacks continue to bear the weight of American racism. That burden is manifest in labor market discrimination, grossly attenuated wealth, confinement to neighborhoods with lower levels of amenities and safety, disproportionate exposure to inferior schooling, significantly greater danger in encounters with the police and the criminal justice system writ large, and a general social disdain for the value of black people's lives. The legal apparatus created by the Civil Rights Revolution does little to address the complex web of harms imposed upon black Americans today. Taken individually, any one of these three tiers of injustice, slavery, the regime of legal segregation and subordination, and current discrimination, makes a powerful case for black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore. Part 1. 1. A political history of America's black reparations movement. The Civil War of 1861 to 65 ended slavery. It left us free, but it also left us homeless, penniless, ignorant, nameless, and friendless. Russia's liberated serf was given 3 acres of land and agricultural implements with which to begin his career of liberty and independence. But to us no foot of land nor implement was given. We were turned loose to starvation, destitution, and death. So desperate was our condition that some of our statesmen declared it useless to try to save us by legislation, as we were doomed to extinction. Ida B. Wells, Class Legislation. Black reparations are damages for America's broken contract with black people. Mirza Baradaran, Black Capitalism Can't Fix the Racial Wealth Gap. Black Agenda Report. Just as enslaved Africans were the first abolitionists, liberating themselves and their families whenever possible, so too were black Americans the nation's earliest architects of reparations. American reparations advocates were motivated by the federal government's failure to fulfill its promise of an endowment of 40 acres and a mule to the formerly enslaved made on multiple occasions toward the end of the Civil War and in the years immediately following 1865. When General William T. Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton asked Reverend Garrison Frazier, a native of Granville County, North Carolina, what he and other freedmen would need to sustain themselves after the Civil War wound down, Reverend Frazier replied, "Land." Sherman and Stanton had come to Savannah, Georgia, in January 1865 to query black leaders about their vision of the way forward, as President Lincoln sought to transform the war-ravaged country. 20 black leaders, also members of the clergy, had selected the Reverend as their spokesman, and he explained, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn and till it by our own labor. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own." The radical wing of the Republican Party, led by Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and John C. Fremont, advocated that lands abandoned by and confiscated from the former Confederates be allotted to freedmen. Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, uncharacteristically, initially was unenthusiastic about the free land for blacks strategy. As early as 1853, in a letter to Harriet Beecher Stowe, Douglass complained that once freed, former slaves would not take eagerly to agriculture unless coerced. He also argued that the very nature of slavery robbed freedmen of sufficient self-reliance to be successful as independent farmers. However, Douglass later came to regret this break with the radical Republicans. By 1876, before the Republican National Convention, Douglass observed that the ongoing plight of the ex-slaves was due in large measure to the failure to grant them land. He favorably invoked the Russian land reform that followed the emancipation of the serfs. When the Russian serfs had their chains broken and were given their liberty, the government of Russia, the despotic government of Russia, gave to those poor emancipated serfs a few acres of land on which they could live and earn their bread. But when you turned us loose, you gave us no acres. You turned us loose to the sky, to the storm, to the whirlwind, and worst of all, you turned us loose to the wrath of our infuriated masters. Subsequently, Douglass repeated time and again the phrase, "The serfs of Russia were given 3 acres of land," contrasting this with nothing being given to formerly enslaved blacks in America. On August 1st, 1880, in a speech given in Elmira, New York, at a celebration of West Indian slave emancipation, Douglass observed, "He who can say to his fellow man, 'You shall serve me or starve,' is a master, and his subject is a slave." This was seen and felt by Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and leading Republican stalwarts, and had their counsels prevailed, the terrible evils from which we now suffer would have been averted. The Negro today would not be on his knees, as he is, abjectly supplicating the old master class to give him leave to toil, nor would he be leaving the South as from a doomed city and seeking a home in the uncongenial North, but tilling his native soil in comparative independence. Still later, in a September 24, 1883 speech before the National Convention of Colored Men in Louisville, Kentucky, he repeated the same themes, saying explicitly that the ongoing poverty and wretchedness of blacks across the South would have been attenuated had the nation heeded the radical Republicans' call for land distribution to freedmen. The nation's descent into post-slavery turpitude was aggravated by going against the voice of Stevens, Sumner, and Wade, and other far-seeing statesmen. One of the earliest known reparations champions, Callie D. Guy House, born in slavery about 1861 in Rutherford County, Tennessee, was a widow with 5 children, making her living as a self-employed laundry worker and clothes maker. She took up the cause of the ex-slaves after seeing a copy of the pamphlet, Vaughan's Freedmen's Pension Bill, a plea for American freedmen, which began circulating in black communities in central Tennessee around 1890. Determined to improve the economic independence of the ex-slaves, Callie House initially joined forces with Walter R. Vaughan, the publisher of the pamphlet. Vaughan was a white Nebraska Democrat and a Southerner whose own lobbying efforts on behalf of the formerly enslaved dated to 1870. A former mayor of Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the son of a slaveholder, he had proposed an ex-slave pension bill in 1890. Eventually, House broke with Vaughan both on principle and tactics. Vaughan argued that the measure should be called the Southern Tax Relief Bill and promoted it for benefit of stimulating the Southern states' economies. Since whites owned the majority of business enterprises, he reasoned blacks would have to purchase goods and services from them and would thereby generate economic growth throughout the South. He made a tidy sum from the sale of the brochures, which sold for $1. Eventually, Vaughan grossed $100,000 against expenses which included lobbying, printing, and marketing, of about $20,000. In 1898, House banded with Isaiah Dickerson, a minister and educator, to charter the grassroots National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, MRBP, in Nashville, Tennessee. Dickerson served as the general manager, and House became the assistant secretary and national promoter of the new organization. Their mission was fourfold. 1. Identify ex-slaves and add their names to the petition for a pension. 2. Lobby Congress to provide pensions for the nation's estimated 1.9 million ex-slaves, 21% of all African Americans by 1899. 3. Start local chapters and provide members with financial assistance when they became incapacitated by illness. And 4. Provide a burial assistance payment when the member died. The MRBP modeled its pension plan for the formerly enslaved on the Civil War program for disabled veterans and families of deceased veterans, approved by Congress on July 14, 1862. If the federal government could compensate elderly disabled veterans for their contributions to the war effort, the organizers reasoned, why not also provide support for the aged ex-slaves who had contributed so much to the growth and development of the country over their lifetimes as coerced and unpaid laborers? One of House's first initiatives was to embark on a 2-year lecture circuit to build local chapters and create the infrastructure necessary to connect them to the burgeoning national organization. Her impact was immediate and profound. A phenomenal recruiter, House signed up at least 34,000 members during those 2 years. By 1916, the MRBP's membership was estimated to be around 300,000. The dues the organization collected from its members made it possible for the staff to pursue its goals. When Reverend Dickerson died in 1909, House assumed the top leadership position. In 1915, the association went on to challenge the federal government in a lawsuit filed on behalf of ex-slaves. The lawsuit asserted that the U.S. Treasury Department owed the freedmen $68 million, the amount it had collected from the sale of slave-grown and slave-harvested cotton that had been confiscated from Confederates toward the end of and immediately after the Civil War. The claim was denied. The association's mission and its bulging membership rolls drew the attention of a variety of federal officials and departments. For some in the U.S. government, the association's steadfast belief that involuntary servitude was a human rights violation and that remedies were owed the former slaves was seen as a threat. In 1916, U.S. Postmaster General A.S. Burleson sought indictments against leaders of the association, claiming that they had obtained money from the formerly enslaved by fraudulent circulars proclaiming that pensions and reparations were forthcoming. House was convicted and served time in the penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri, from November 1917 to August 1918. While the federal government succeeded in shutting down House's organization, her followers continued to advance the campaign. Many of them joined Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. During the 20th century, there were numerous indictments in which black claims to reparations seemed justified. Chicago was one of 25 cities that erupted in racial violence during the summer of 1919, which became known as Red Summer. Black veterans returning from World War I deployments in Europe and across the globe were frustrated to find that discrimination and the routine violent attacks from whites contradicted their status as full citizens in the United States. To compound matters, well-remunerated employment commensurate with the skills the men had honed during their years in the service was in short supply. On July 27, 1919, a black teenager who was swimming with friends in Lake Michigan drifted across the color barrier and was stoned to death by a group of white men. The police officer who arrived on the scene refused to arrest the assailants identified by eyewitnesses. The subsequent uproar led to a week of rioting. Ultimately, 25 blacks and 13 whites were killed. 537 people were injured, some of them severe.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?